Hi guys, my name is Hannah. I'm going to be presenting to you tonight how to live the retirement you've always dreamed of. We've got quite a lot we're going to cover off this evening, and I'm going to be taking some questions at the end. So just a little bit of housekeeping. We are recording tonight's session. If you miss any of it, if you need your partner to watch it, you'll get that sent to you as well. We'll be taking Q&A at the end. If you do have any questions, just pop them in the Q&A button at the bottom. That will feed through to my producer who's going to ask me some questions. I tend to talk quite fast, so I apologize in advance. I guess before we officially get started, when it comes to creating a financial plan or a financial strategy, it really needs to be nuanced for you. Your tendencies, where you're starting from, where you're trying to get to, the time frame you've got to work with, the trump cards you've either got to play or you don't have to play. That's really nuanced and tailored. Tonight, I'm not going to be giving any nuanced advice. I'm going to be talking to you about general principles that we apply at Enable Me to our clients to help them maximize their chance of financial success. So I'm going to start applying those, and I'm going to layer them up quite quickly, because a true financial plan, like a successful strategy, is very, very dynamic. It takes into account who you are and what you're not. It takes into account your financial mindset, the integration of values between you and your partner, your tendencies, and many other things. But the principles I'm going to cover off tonight. You are going to be invited to have a one-on-one consultation with some of our top financial consultants. And their job is to get a sense of where you're at and what you're trying to achieve, and whether we need to get you working smarter as well as your money working harder, or whether it might just be one of those things. But we've got a whole heap that we're going to be covering off, and I just want to thank you very much for joining us tonight. So tonight we're talking about retirement, living the retirement that you want. And of course, that's a subjective outcome, right? We've all got different needs, different tastes, different levels of lifestyle. But tonight we're going to cover off what your retirement is going to cost and how you calculate that. We're going to understand, well, we've got these pensions from the government, which are a pretty beautiful thing. How far do the pensions go to solving our retirement problem? How far does your Kiwisaver go? Does that have a big role to play? And if you're not in Kiwisaver, if you've been in Kiwisaver your whole life, what does that look like? How much are you going to need? So that's the difference between, yes, we know what your retirement will cost, but what are you going to have? And because I guess the gap is between what you're likely to have and what you need. That gap is the critical piece of the puzzle, right? And depending on the size of that gap and the tools you've got to work with, you're going to have different strategies that you can apply and how you close that out. That's when you get your money working harder for you. So I'm going to go through that as well. Then we'll give you some key takeaways and look at the Q&A. So there's a bit. Now, again, we're going to start to layer these things up really fast. So when we work to retirement, and some people are working to retirement in their 40s, some people are in their late 50s or even early 60s, and some people are kind of on the doorstep of retirement. But wherever you're starting, there are two things we first understand. When we think about retirement, are we thinking about you and your partner, or are we thinking about you and your partner, or just you and the wider family, kids, parents, whatever it looks like? Because whether we've got to think about just a smaller subset or a bigger subset materially changes the strategy that we need to apply. So that's the first question you need to be asking. And you can kind of get a gauge, right? When you look at your kids and your parents, you're like, well, either your parents are going to be sussed, or they are, or you know that they're not. And your kids, I mean, I take one look at my kids and I just think, heaven help me all. But you know, if you're going to have to give them a bit of a boost, right? And I think the thing about kids is that it doesn't really matter philosophically if you believe you should help your kids out financially to help them become independent. I don't think the philosophy makes any difference. The reality is, if your children, adult children, are not thriving financially, that becomes your problem as the parent. Whether that's through guilt or other reasons, it does become your problem. And one of the things that we spend a lot of time coaching our clients on is learning to fix your own oxygen mask first when it comes to your retirement before we worry about the kids. But if they're part of the wider scheme of things, of course, we need to be factoring that in. And there are some pretty cute ways we can do that without disadvantaging you. So let's get to the problem. We have a savings problem in this country. We're not particularly good at saving for a variety of reasons. One of them is that our house prices are pretty big. So our mortgages make up a quite a large chunk of our income. And there's not as much left over than in some countries. But if we've got that problem, but we're also a bit useless with money. So those two things together mean that most people are not getting ahead at the pace that they could be relative to their income. But the problem here is we're not really saving enough. We know that 95% of Kiwis do not have a plan to ensure they'll have enough for retirement. And some of that is because they don't even know where to start. They don't know what number they're aiming for. If you don't know where you're aiming for and you're not even sure how to diagnose where you're starting from, it is pretty difficult, right, to create a plan. I get it. We'll go through that with you tonight. But 95% of us don't actually have a plan. 79% of us don't know how much we're going to need for retirement. So that would explain why you don't have a plan. But even if you did know what you need, that doesn't necessarily mean that you change your behaviors to solve the problem, right? But it does help if you know what you're aiming for, usually. So once we've worked out whether we're just worried about you or you and your partner as one unit or a wider family, we then need to overlay a couple more assumptions. And depending on your answer to those assumptions determines the type of strategy we need to be applying now and the different layers that need to be added to that and the sequence behind it. So the three assumptions that feed into any retirement, there is an assumption that you have created financially independent kids by the time you retire. If you haven't, we have to call that, we've got to name that, and we've got to attribute a cost to not having achieved that, and that's going to feed into your retirement problem. We can fix it, but we just talk. I apologize, I'm going to be really direct. It's a lot easier. So have we created financially independent kids? You'll know that or you're not. Have you got financially independent parents? You will know that just whether you've got to help them out, whether you think you're going to be helping them out more as they get older. Again, it becomes your problem if that's not working usually. So let's just factor that into our thinking. The other assumption is that you were mortgage free by the time you were 65. Now, if the answer to those is if you're not on track with those things, that just changes what you're going to need for your retirement. It changes how long you've got to save, and it also changes how much you've got left over to save. It doesn't make it wrong or impossible, but it has a big impact on what we're aiming for. So it doesn't tend to be that helpful to compare your retirement plan against someone else's, because already there could be 4 different assumptions that you might not align with just one of them, and it will materially change what strategy you need to apply. So if those are the assumptions, what are the odds? Well, we know that more than 1 million Kiwi parents are supporting their adult children. So that suggests they're not financially independent. We need to fix that. For those who are on track to be mortgage-free by retirement, only 38% of those in the run-up to retirement are on track to be mortgage-free. Now, that creates a rub that we need to be really tactical about. And again, we need to probably be more ambitious with your wealth strategy, because not only do we need to save for your retirement, but we've got to save for your retirement and clear your mortgage. So there's more of a gap that needs to be closed out. And then we've got that sandwich generation, where those that are helping the parents and their kids, which is kind of it's the sandwich generation. 1 in 7 adults are supporting both parents and adult children. Painful. But if that's your reality, we don't want to change that, as in if that's your commitment or that's where your values sit. We're not going to debate that. We're just going to show you how you can solve for that problem. And again, we need to apply a different strategy. I'm going to talk about these strategies in a second. I just need you to start to understand how dynamic the plan needs to be. So then we come to the next question, the big question: how much do you need to retire? And the numbers kind of vary, but I'm going to give you some rules of thumb. When we're calculating, for you to live the retirement that you want, There's an assumption that you're able to live the lifestyle to which you are accustomed to, right? That's what living the retirement you want is. So when we're trying to work out what that costs, we're saying, well, what is your life costs now? You might not know the answer, but you could work it in reverse, right? And maybe get an envelope or a pen and jot this down. So what's your total income that you've got coming into your household each year after tax? And what are you saving? And the difference is what your lifestyle costs. It's what you're spending. Now, you could potentially be spending less, like your lifestyle could be inflated. You could be frittering. There could be inefficiencies. I understand that. And that's one of the things that we want to try and squeeze out because it materially changes things. But before we get to any of the solutions, what does it cost now? And whatever that cost is, we then multiply that by 25 because we think that you're going to be retired from age 65 to 90. And of course, you might work longer, you might spend less in retirement, not usually to start with. In fact, you tend to spend more to start with. But let's just start there. So your lifestyle costs times 25 years is what we need to be able to access to fund your lifestyle, the lifestyle you want to live for as long as possible. That's our starting point. Now, Sorted has run some averages across New Zealand on what it's costing them to live different retirement. The problem with this is it includes low-income families in these numbers. And if you yourself are not a low-income family, then it's not necessarily comparable to you because they're taking averages, right? But a no-frills lifestyle, so that's no holidays, certainly not helping your adult children or your parents. It's probably eating about $80 worth of food a week, just living very, very small, no treats. A no-frills lifestyle is up to $46,000 a year. A choices lifestyle, and I think that that's a pretty generous use of the word choices, because I think it's only like $100 a week at the supermarket, and I don't even think there's any holidays in that, but again, that can stretch up to $75,000. So you've got a bit more to do there on average. At the Enable Me end, we've got some clients who retire and they can live on their pension, which I think is incredible. Obviously, they've got a mortgage-free home and a very big vegetable garden. Through to those who spend a few $100,000s a year to fund their retirement. That's their lifestyle to which they are accustomed. And there's no right or wrong answer. There's just your answer. The average, I guess, if there was a bell curve, we'd be saying it's around that 100 to 120,000 seems to be kind of a takeaway for moderate living, which is the odd holiday, being able to have a comfortable Christmas and socialize with your friends and your family more often than not. That's what would be built into that. So in that situation, if we said $100,000 was the average, we'd be saying, okay, and this is after you've paid off your mortgage, once that cost no longer exists, $100,000. So for 25 years of retirement, that would suggest we need $100,000 times 25, which is 2.5 million. Yeah. There we go. Look at that slide. $100,000 a year for 25 years is 2.5 million. Now the pension's going to contribute around $18,000, maybe $20,000 a year for those years as well. So that's going to actually be a big inroad to your own retirement number. And we can deduct that. We can also deduct your Kiwisaver contributions as well. So depending on what that balance is in this situation, we're saying it's around 500,000 between, if this is a couple, you and your partner, 250 each. Of course, we've got to overlay your exact numbers, but this is the starting point. So we say we need 2.5 million for what I would say is a pretty sustainable lifestyle, but we've got things that are actually helping us close or reduce that gap. So when we look at what we've got after those things have been taken into account, assuming your lifestyle is costing 100,000, it's 1.36 million is the retirement savings gap, right? So that is the problem I'm trying to determine. And then I'm trying to work out, well, how else can I get that down before I start to work on my strategy to close it? The smaller the gap, the more likely you will close it, right? And the size of the gap doesn't really bother us, to be honest, because we've got gaps that have been, you know, a few million. It tends to be relative to the income, which is the potential of that situation as well. But here we go. So that once we've got that gist, so that's taking, I guess, we're diagnosing your starting point right now based on what I would assume are quite a few inefficiencies within how you run your money, the amount of fritter, perhaps how you've structured your mortgage, your insurances, even your Kiwisaver. All those inefficiencies add up, but I'm not taking those into account just yet. So we're overlaying the government pension. Of course, that's slightly different depending on whether you're single or a couple. We want to overlay your Kiwisaver balance at retirement. We need to understand, are you mortgage free? Are you still going to have a mortgage, or are you renting? If you are renting in retirement, that means you're going to have to save more, usually because your living costs are higher, because it has to take into account ongoing accommodation costs. So that's one of the reasons why we try to get you mortgage free by retirement, is we're trying to lower your accommodation or your living costs. And that's one of the easiest ways to do that. We then want to work out, well, what's the lifestyle that you want to live? What's your bucket list priorities? I mean, we do know that most retirees are at their fittest, their healthiest between 65 to kind of 75. So that's when the big travel happens. It's not only when it's big travel, but it's often when you want to do things with your family so you can enjoy it. But what are your bucket list priorities? How long do you expect to live? I mean, some people definitely have long living genes that we will take into account, but we want to start at 90. The most common piece of feedback I get when people aren't on track to achieve their retirement goals, or it looks like they're going to run out of money early, they will say flippantly, I guess I need to make sure I'm not alive by then. And I know they're kind of joking, but it's kind of a really stink joke, because that's not a strategy. We need to make sure we've solved the problem, right? Of course, you might retire before 65. You might keep working beyond 65. We need to then factor in, are we supporting family? What are your healthcare needs? Are we able to downsize any of these assets or start to liquidate assets? All of those need to be added to your situation, right? And that takes a little bit to work through, but that's what we try and do at pace with our clients. So then I'll try and bring this to life. We've got a client that comes to see us, that's you, and you're age 45. We want to get a snapshot of what are you on track to have if you do nothing? Because you've got to know that that's your default, and hopefully that's motivation enough for you to want to do something. But in this particular situation, the client is age 45 and they're on track to pay off their mortgage by 65. They've got a 20-year term on that mortgage. So they're in that top 38%, which is amazing. So they're mortgage free at retirement, which is kind of the tick, but they don't have any cash. There's no savings outside of that mortgage, apart from their Kiwisaver. So at retirement, they're mortgage free, wonderful. Their Kiwisaver gets paid out, amazing. And then they live off that. But if they want to live the lifestyle to which they are accustomed, the lifestyle of their dreams, on average, they're going to run out of that money within the first 3 to 4 years, which is okay. That's their reality. So then we've got a gap between then and 90 that we're aiming for. So that's their initial gap. But before I start to solve for that gap, I want to go, well, hold on a minute. Am I actually able to reduce that gap by doing things smarter immediately on a day-to-day basis? And then I'll get the money working harder to close out that gap. The smaller the gap, the more likely you are to be able to close it out. The average gap of an Enable Me customer when they come to see us is just over $1 million. That doesn't bother us. So in this particular situation, we're like, okay, well, let's forget what you've always done. Let's assume we can put you through your paces and we can really start to crank things. Get rid of all the inefficiencies. And often there isn't one area where you are particularly bad with money. Usually you're just a little bit inefficient across a whole lot of areas. And when we start to bring them together, that actually does create an impact. So on average, we know that our customers, before they work with us, fritter 15% of their income. So they're spending money necessarily unconsciously, just not deliberately, perhaps. Their mortgages aren't structured correctly. They don't know what they're aiming for. In the absence of a goal, they just feel like they can spend. They're not particularly bad. They probably would describe themselves as floating financially. But on average, we can find between 15 to 20% of their income, and we can put that money to work. So we put it to work in the first instance by paying off their mortgage faster. That serves 2-3 things for us. firstly, we get mortgage-free faster. The sooner you're mortgage-free, the sooner you're able to start paying or saving for retirement. And it's a lot easier to save when you don't have 40 grand a year going out on a mortgage payment. So we save $1 to pay the mortgage off. That saves us interest that we don't have to pay to the bank because we're going to be mortgage-free faster. And in addition to that, we are mortgage-free faster. So we're able to save more for retirement. Now, because we're saving more though, our living costs are slightly lower. So for us to have found that 15%, we've reduced our living costs by 15%. So that means that not only are we able to save faster, but we are eating into our savings at a slower rate in retirement, right? So it's kind of like benefit on top of benefit on top of benefit. In this particular scenario, we're saying, well, instead of being mortgage-free at 65, which is the customer's kind of trajectory, let's get them down to 10 years. On average, that's what we achieve for our clients. So we're able to do that. That's awesome. So then at 55, we're able to save for retirement instead of 65. And we're saving faster because we don't have a mortgage and our living costs are lower. So we're also saving that as well. So that means between 55 to 65, we've now saved close to another $700,000 because we got smarter on a day-to-day basis. Now, what does that mean? Well, that's $700,000 of extra equity savings, whatever we want to call it, is money I don't need to, that's going to be reducing my gap, I guess. So you can see that we've saved more, which is awesome. That funds us for longer in retirement because we've got more to work with. So the gap has shrunk. And how much has the gap shrunk by? Well, it's shrunk in this situation by around $700,000. So we've gone from a gap of 1.3 million to 700,000. That materially changes the strategy that I want to be able to apply, right? And not only does it change the strategy because the gap's smaller, I've got longer for that strategy to come off because I'm running out of money later. And the longer we've got for the strategy to work, or the longer the runway, the lower the return that we need to get on that investment. Or the inverse of that is the less risk we need to take. What is risk? Well, risk is the probability of you landing where you need to land at the right time. The more risk you introduce, the less likely you're going to be able to land at the right time as it relates to your retirement goals. I often try and use the analogy, I say, as a financial advisor or a wealth coach. My job is to help my clients land the helicopter of retirement on the head of a pin, usually in high winds. And the least amount of risk you need to take, the bigger the landing pad, the more likely you're going to be able to do it, right? And it's all about numbers. No emotion. You're allowed 5% emotion, 95% numbers. So then when we go, okay, well, we've got this gap. We've tried to reduce this gap, which is awesome. That's great. But we still have a gap. So then what are our options to close that gap? And it's different for different people, but the general list of options is consistent, which is, well, you could earn more if you wanted to. I mean, that's not always something that's within your control, to be honest, but that technically would help you lower your gap if you save the extra income. What we do know is that from a behavioral economics perspective, you just tend to kind of stretch out your living a little bit more as the income increases. But in theory, let's assume that you contained that lifestyle creep, that extra income would be helpful. Or you could spend less. It doesn't really appeal to many of us. Perhaps an option. You could work longer, maybe. You could receive an inheritance. You could die earlier. These all help reduce your retirement gap. I guess those three aren't particularly attractive. Yeah, we don't really like to factor in inheritances until they're banked. It's kind of uncomfortable to factor in someone dying to fund it. I guess my learning with inheritances is, of course, that it's amazing to receive. Like it's a blessing to receive an inheritance, but they tend to come at the wrong time. You know, like when you really need the money, an inheritance would be wonderful, but it doesn't tend to come to you at the right time. The inheritance usually comes after you've actually solved for that problem, and it's wonderful, but it doesn't always come at the right time, normally 20 years after, when it would have been really, really helpful. But the other options we've got, we could try and pay the mortgage off faster. We could invest in shares, manage funds, other assets. You could leverage to invest in property. You could downsize your home sooner. So those are kind of the options, right? And we now have to design a plan that starts to work through, well, what's going to be the best option for you? And it's likely that many of those options could be layered up, but what is the sequence that we should be applying that to maximize the probability of achieving the outcome? So a lot of people say, well, we'll work longer, but the reality is most people retire earlier than they initially planned. And that's normally due to things outside of their control, if I'm being honest. It's either due to health concerns, or ageism, where you are disadvantaged in your role. Now, of course, most of us think that we will continue working in some capacity, but that work doesn't necessarily need to be paid work. I think many people move more into charity work and fulfilling work as you hang up your gloves of your 9-to-5er. But most people in paid employment end up retiring much earlier than what they anticipated. So that's reference from the Commission of Financial Capability that runs studies on this. So I guess my point there is, if you're relying on working for much longer beyond that 65, we do have to overlay that the probability of that happening is lower than your desire in most instances. And I don't care how we get to the outcome. My job, right, is to try and land that helicopter for you. And so I'm trying to layer up all these things that we can pull, levers we can pull, if your preferred way of getting there isn't available to you for whatever reason. The other thing people ask is that, or think that they'll downsize their home, which of course is a wonderful thing to do. But that's a trump card you don't want to play prematurely. But when they play that, they never quite get on average, the return they deserve for the sacrifice that's being made. And it translates, again, using the Financial Services Council's data, to around 3 years of extra retirement. So it's not usually the silver bullet we're expecting it to be. It is helpful though, of course. When we are looking at a retirement plan, or the Enable Me retirement plan, we are trying to layer in or bring in all these different modules or components to work overall to solve your problem. Because it's not just about doing one thing in isolation. I think that as we have those headwinds that we're experiencing, you've got to get all of these components working elegantly together to try and maximize the overall momentum that is being created. And if you just do one thing in isolation, you're not building the right foundations. Your foundations aren't as strong as what they need to be in order to weather some of the headwinds that we know is kind of right in front of us. And that's fine, we'll work through that. So I guess just going through some of the components that we try and bring in. So we start with, well, what's your behavior and your mindset? That has a material impact on whether you're going to be able to engage on the plan or the type of plan that you're going to find easier to stick to. There's no point having a game plan if you're not going to stick to it. What is the point? It's all about the ability to execute that plan, and to be able to execute that when there is noise and uncertainty around you. That's when most people just are paralyzed. And it's not that they don't want to do anything, it's just either life gets in the way, or they think, well, I'm just not sure what I'll do, so I just will pause. Not realizing that pausing creates more risk for them overall, because all they've done is shorten the runway for which we need to solve the problem for. And in shortening that runway, they've done two other things. They've increased the risk we need to take in order to solve the problem. And in addition to that, they have reduced how much the bank is going to be prepared to help them because they're getting older. So I get why we want to pause, but you've got to understand the opportunity and the opportunity cost of these decisions. And I think when you start to understand that, you actually get more confident in doing what needs to be done, looking down the barrel of the gun, right, and being able to execute. So it starts with your behaviors and your mindset. Then we need to overlay your cash flow strategy. Do you even have one? Are you managing your money well? What is the pace that you are saving? Are you saving 20% of your income? If you're not, we can fix that. Of course we can fix that. If you already are, great. We can then start to move on to the next level, which is how quickly are you paying off your mortgage? Are you doing it as fast as possible? If you're already mortgage free, that's great. We move on to the next level, which is your risk. We are relying on your income continuing up until retirement. What if it doesn't? What strategy can we apply for that? And you can self-insure if you want. It doesn't bother me. But self-insuring does actually have a number. It's not a philosophy. So we need to make sure that we've got enough capital, because again, it's about the numbers. And then once we've got those things, those are your, I guess, your foundation. That's your engine room that we then build your wealth strategy around. And when we're looking at wealth strategies, we tend to look in 5-year chunks, and we've got to work out, are we trying to grow wealth or are we trying to hold wealth? And depending on those strategies, we've got different assets that we would be looking to use. Then the next thing, once we've grown the wealth, we then need to move to eating into the wealth. That is one of the most uncomfortable things you can do. You think that you would love it. I've created all this money for me to enjoy, but it is uncomfortable. And it becomes more and more uncomfortable to eat into or start depleting your nest egg unless you know when it's going to run out, right? And so what we see with people is that unless they've got that plan and understand the impact of all of those decisions, they either have anxiety when it comes to spending money, which would defeat the whole idea of living a retirement you enjoy. So they either got anxiety or they just don't spend. We don't want that. And of course, we need to round that out with the estate strategy. A lot of people don't spend because they want to leave stuff for the kids or the grandkids. I get that, but that should be serving the rest of your plan. Remember, we fix your own oxygen mask first, and we give you permission to do that. We will make sure the kids are sorted, but you come first. So behavior and mindset, living off your wealth requires a different mindset to growing your wealth. It requires a different strategy and different systems. And if you don't have those systems in place, your well-being will be impacted. You'll either feel guilty from spending, anxious from spending, or you won't spend. Either of those things impact your well-being, right? So we want to fix that. And we spend a lot of time working on that with our clients. We want you to enjoy how hard you have worked and to know that it is safe to do so. So I mentioned just a couple of minutes ago that depending on our wealth strategy depends on whether we need to be growing wealth or whether we need to be holding on to wealth or starting to reduce wealth. So often when we're trying to grow wealth, we would want to have 75% of your investment base invested in a leveraged asset and 25% in a non-leveraged asset. So I guess that might mean that you've got an investment property, which would be leveraged, and you would have a Kiwisaver account, which is unleveraged. And the split we prefer when we're growing wealth is 75-25. So whatever equity you've got in your Kiwisaver, the balance of your Kiwisaver, we'd be wanting 3 times that equity tied up in a leveraged asset. Now, leverage is the key to growing wealth faster than a non-leveraged asset, which I'm going to talk about in a second. If you've already grown your wealth and it's about holding, then we want to have a 50-50 split between property and non-property assets. And if we're at the stage where we're actually trying to simplify and we don't need to grow wealth, we don't need to offset inflation, we've got plenty, then we would move to having 75% of your wealth in managed funds, shares, or non-property, and 25% in property perhaps. So depending on what we're trying to achieve from a wealth perspective, we've got a different split in that balance between property and non-property assets. Yeah. So then we go to the next slide. What are you, if you've got a retirement gap, let's say we've got it down to 700,000, what are our options? Well, assuming you had cash to invest, and I know that not everyone does, right? But we'll start with that assumption. If you had cash to invest, money sitting in a savings account or a managed fund, you could put it in the bank and get a term deposit rate, maybe 2%. You could put it in a managed fund. Maybe you'd get between 4 to 6 to 7%, depending on the growth asset exposure within that fund. You could put it into property. If you had $100,000, I don't think you'd get a $100,000 property, but maybe you'd get a 6% return. If you did have a $100,000 property, put it into shares, you'd get a bit more, right? So that's kind of the mix of where you could put that money. And those are all valid options. And it really comes down to, well, what's the return you get for the money you've put in? It's all about the return. If you had $100,000, you put it into a managed fund, let's say a 6% return, at the end of the year, you're going to have $6,000 in the bank or in the managed fund, right? That's your return. If you put that money into property, you wouldn't buy a $100,000 property, would you? You would borrow $400,000 and you'd purchase a $500,000 property. And so whilst you might only be getting a 6% return on that property, you can see that for that same investment, you're getting a $30,000 return, even though you've only used $100,000 of your own money. So you compare that to the managed fund, it's 300% higher. It's not that property is amazing, it is that leverage is amazing. And leverage is what helps you grow wealth. Now, really, you can only use leverage really with property. And that's not to say that you need to invest in property. You need to first understand what is the gap that you're trying to close. What is the size of that gap? If that gap is more than $300,000, it is most likely you will need leverage to have a shot at closing that gap, unless you're happy to commit to working much longer. And that's something you can't actually guarantee. Or you are going to commit to downsizing your home and release more money sooner. That's probably something you don't want to trigger, right? So it comes down to the size of your gap as to what is the right strategy. Now, for property, I don't know what managed funds, property, I don't know actually any investment, what they will do tomorrow. I don't know what they will do in the next month or the next quarter. They're going to go up and down. But what I know is that over time, these assets increase in value, right? And even if they increased in value at the same rate that they have always done, property through leverage will outperform a managed fund on average by more than 300%. You have to pay attention to that if you've got a gap that requires you to get a greater return, but you still have a small amount of money to start with. So whether it's property or not, let's understand the problem you're trying to solve and let's narrow down the investment options to legitimately solve that. Now, when we're trying to design the wealth strategy, which is that mix between property and non-property assets, we're looking at a whole lot of things to narrow down so that can be finessed for you. We first want to look at the size of your shortfall, right? If your gap is only $50,000, we could probably just get you saving a little bit more and you will close that. But if your gap is $1 million, you're never going to be able to save that. So we need to understand the size of your shortfall. We need to know when we're going to access that wealth. When are we naturally going to run out of our savings in retirement? Is it at 66, a year after you've retired? Or is it at 75 or 80? The longer we can make that, the more runway we've got, or the more time we've got to get a return. And if you've got more time, you need less of a return on an annual basis, right? So that will determine what is the return we need. Then we overlay, well, what's your risk appetite? How much risk can you stomach? So the risk is the inverse of the return. The higher the return, the more risk you need to take. So if you need a high return, but if your stomach for risk is quite low, methinks there is a problem, right? So that will become an uncomfortable investment, and we need to be able to unpack that for you. So you've got your risk appetite, how much you can stomach, and then you've got your risk tolerance, how much your situation can absorb. Those are two different things. And then you've got the third piece, which is the risk that you need to take. Now, if there's not alignment between those three things, it is, and you're not getting coached or supported through that transaction, you're going to feel like you've got war in your members. What does that mean? It means that it is unlikely you will be able to sustain what you need to sustain because there is friction, internal friction. And so if it's going to reduce the probability, that we've got to address that, right? Because we're all about increasing the probability of success, not trying to pull that back. And lastly, we need to overlay the risk of market corrections, inflation, and the time frame that we're working to. From a decumulation strategy, your first 5 to 10 years of retirement, you tend to be active, it's bucket list things, you're traveling, you've got higher expenses often in the 5 years leading up to retirement. Because so many people say to me, oh, when I retire, I'm just going to cut back my living. It's like, no, that's not the data that we see with our customers. In the 10 years following that, you definitely are less active. And so some of your discretionary costs reduce for sure. but your health costs increase. And sometimes, I mean, overall, there's still about a 10 to 15% saving, but it is never as big as what it feels like it's going to be. And in your final years, of course, your discretionary spending cuts right back. Your fixed costs haven't changed. They haven't changed the whole way through. And your fixed costs make up the majority of your spending anyway. But your discretionary absolutely cuts back, but that is offset at times by higher health needs. So we've got to factor that into how we invest funds as well. From an estate planning perspective, we want to consider how would you like your assets distributed? How can we protect those assets? And how to protect your inheritance for your kids. I do tend to take quite a cynical view of the partner of your children. And I just assume that, I better keep careful what I say, that your money isn't for them, it's for your kids. And if they were to separate, I kind of take the view that they will separate. I need to know that the money you've given your child stays with your child. If you don't structure that correctly, it is a payday for the spouse, which would be the ex-spouse. So we're just going to be really careful with that as well. So these are some of the things that we want to start to overlay. But the first thing we've got to do is we've got to understand what is the gap that we are trying to close out. Then can we make that smaller by making you work smarter? And on average, we can. On average, over a 10-year period, we create about $1 million worth of benefit for our clients. We do that through a few ways. We obviously get them saving more if they are faster or better. In addition to that, we get them mortgage-free faster. That saves them interest costs and allows us to start saving for retirement. And in addition to that, we put their equity to work in their home and we look to buy an investment property to get the capital growth on that. And the combination of all those things translates to $1 million of layered benefit that they weren't on track to achieve themselves. So the first thing we've got to understand is, can we get you as efficient as possible? And then can we get your money working harder? And if we can, that is your wealth strategy. That's the exciting part. Of course, that's the exciting part. I was working with a client today and with another coach. And they're like, well, they're pretty keen to build an investment property portfolio. And you kind of have a rough rule of thumb that we work to, that you need at least one investment property for your own retirement. You need 2 investment properties if you're wanting to help your kids. And the idea with that second property is that you don't necessarily need to tell them, but the gain on that property is earmarked for them. And that property might be sold, and that gain could be used as a deposit for their own home, maybe to help buy a business for them, pay off their student loans, but it's to help give them a kickstart. Because the last thing you want is for your kids to be starting adulthood and feeling like it is hopeless. And so many of them measure financial success. 88% of those sub 35 kind of that are working, so young adults in our sense of the word, but maybe 25 to 35-year-olds, 88% of them measure home ownership as the socially accepted measure of financial success, right? So 88% of them think that. 88% of them, I'm assuming it's the same 88%, 88% of them do not believe it is possible for them. So if we as a parent can create some hope for them, of course you would want to do that. But we need to do that in a really safe way. So one property for your own retirement, maybe the second property to help the kids onto the property ladder, most likely into an investment property rather than their home, and a third property if you want to retire earlier. So that's if you're trying to grow wealth. So there's many reasons why we want to do that. Once we've grown the wealth, of course, we want to diversify outside of property, but it's not property that we are so excited about. It's just leverage that we are excited about. But we need to be able to take a longer term view. Not all properties are created equal. I'd probably say that 90% of investment properties on the market are a lemon or of the citrus variety. Because not only do you need to buy the right property, which we are really specific on setting that criteria, but you need to have the right hold strategy. You need to be able to hold until that property gives you the growth that you need from it. And that growth isn't in a straight line. I wish it was. The reality is the growth sits on the other side of a recession. That's how the economic cycle works. So if we don't have the right hold strategy, we're going to be releasing that property before we even made the money. And that's what we need to avoid. So there's a little bit in there. But key takeaways: guesstimate how much you're going to need based on your lifestyle costs. Annual costs, take off your mortgage costs if you're going to be mortgage-free by retirement. Times that amount by 25 years or 25. That gives you your number. We want to take off the pension. We want to take off what your Kiwisaver is, and that's really roughly your gap. Are you on track? Could you be smarter? You will just have a gut feel if you can, usually. But some clients work with us, they're as efficient as they can be, and all they actually want is the wealth advice and the wealth support or ability to execute that safely. I get it. So I'm going to take some questions, but before I take questions, I'd love you to come to a consultation. We've got a special offer for that during Money Week this week. Normally that consultation is $350 plus GST. It's discounted to $250 plus GST. And you've got a couple of months to book that consultation. But if you do book it in the month of August, you will get two things will happen. You'll go in the draw to have one of our 12-month programs refunded to you, which is a value of $4,500. And if you do go ahead with the program, that cost of that consultation is actually going to be discounted off that program as well. So it's pretty exciting. But that'll all be sent out to you. Yeah, I've got some questions, team, I believe. Over to you.
Yes, we do. Thanks, Hannah. We've had quite a few come through live as well as some pre-submitted. So I'll just tackle one of the live ones first because someone's asking for a bit of clarification about the averages that you showed a bit earlier in the deck. Were they per person or per couple, that 100,000 figure?
Oh, that's for a couple. That $100,000 was for a couple, but it really is, it just comes down to their situation. I think if I wasn't in a relationship, I'm pretty sure that I'd be spending $100,000 a year just on myself. But that number that I was referencing, that was a couple. It doesn't have, if you're single, because there are economies of scale of remaining in a couple. So if ever there is an incentive to stay married, that might be it. But generally, if you're single, so if it was 100 to 120,000 as a couple, I'd probably say as a single person that could be 60 to 75 might be the average there.
Awesome. Thanks for clarifying. I hope they've got more reason to stay together than just that economy of scale though, but each their own. We've had another question, another clarification question around that lifestyle calculation. Does it include inflation?
No, those are today's numbers. So I guess there's an assumption that it sort of does include inflation, just not on your investments. So your income's supposed to go up with inflation and your expenses go up with inflation, but let's say they've gone up by the same amount. So the difference is still the same, and your pension goes up with inflation. So the income and expenses have been inflation adjusted, but it's still, if you get rid of inflation, it's still the same net amount that we're dealing with.
Awesome. Thanks, Hannah. We've also had someone ask if you get taxed on your Kiwisaver funds as you take them out from 65.
No, you've been taxed on the way in, babe. So you're not going to be taxed on the way out.
That would be pretty cruel if you were.
Well, it wouldn't be the first time governments have made unusual policies, but no, it's after tax income has been invested.
Another Kiwisaver question, without getting too specific, they have a fund and it seems to be fluctuating up and down, but though they perceive that it never goes up, just sits the same amount, then slightly drops again. And they're wondering if there's anything they can do to make it move in a positive direction. Is there any way to hack it?
Well, I don't know if hack is the right word. It sounds like you're not in the right fund. So instead of picking a fund, which tends to be kind of the fun part, right? I want to go with this fund based on whatever knowledge I'm assuming or whatever article you've read. But before you do that, we need to first understand, well, what is the return that we need to be getting from your Kiwisaver? And what is the right lane that you need to be in first? Then we look at within that lane or growth exposure, what are the best products in that range by provider, and then we look to choose the product after that. So a lot of people, Kiwis especially, and I guess I understand why, because I do it for other things, but they choose the product, and it's like, but you need to have the right strategy before you narrow down to the product. And I think sometimes people like the brand of something, and the brand can be comforting, but the actual product performance is weak. And that could be because that product just isn't the best in that particular range, or it could be that you're just in the wrong product lane to start with. So there's kind of many things that we need to work through. And that's one of the things that we analyze quite closely here, because your Kiwisaver does account for around 30% of what we need it to be for your own retirement. So we definitely need it to be working as hard as what it should be. but we're not aligned to any particular product. It's just what is the right one for your situation.
Good advice. How easy is it to get a mortgage in your late 50s for a rental or investment?
It gets harder, absolutely, but certainly not impossible. But there's a diminishing return, I guess, from around 57 to 58 onwards, where the banks are less likely to be helpful. They'll still be helpful, but to a smaller amount, and that's diminishing each year. And so for anyone really over 50 that are pausing on doing anything, I'm thinking, no, don't pause. You don't realize the impact of you pausing, because the problem is that if we've got less to work with, we have to take more risk. And the more risk you take, the less likely you're going to land where you need to land in the time frame, right? So we're all about trying to increase the probability of getting there. But I would say at least 30% of our clients are in the late 50s, early 60s, and many, if not most, we're able to qualify for a mortgage, but often we've got to get their house in order first, and the banks are more sensitive to spending and saving patterns, so we're trying to get them bank ready before we look to do that. And we have to look at non-bank products to consider all the wider options.
Awesome. Another Kiwisaver question. We've got bucket loads of these. My husband and I are nearly at retirement age. Should we leave our savings in Kiwisaver until the market bounces back so we don't crystallize the losses that are occurring each month? They're both still working and won't need the Kiwisaver at the start of their retirement.
As a general rule, yes. I wouldn't be wanting to crystallize anything. But if your fund, that example of that person who about to say phoned in, who wrote the message earlier, that if you're in a poor performing fund, I'm not sure sticking around is going to be a good thing. I'd much rather cut my losses and put that money to work. But if it literally is a timing thing, then yes, no, I wouldn't be looking to realize anything. Whether you should be cashing that Kiwisaver in at retirement or keeping it in Kiwisaver is a separate question that I wouldn't be able to answer until I knew the rest, the wider piece of your wealth plan. But yeah, you don't need to cash it yet.
Awesome. Now, I've had someone question your statement around 90% of investment properties being a lemon. So I think they want a bit of clarification on that.
Yes, I said lemon or of a citrus variety. I think which is not as good as what they could be. So there's lots of average properties on the market. And I think anyone can buy an average property. To me, an average property is of the citrus variety. When I'm working with my clients, I am very specific around what the criteria needs to be, because I am solving for a problem. They are paying me to solve that problem, right? So if their gap is $700,000, and if I've got 15 years until I run out of money, or 10 years till I run out of money, I need to have created another $700,000 for that client by that time frame. That's what I need to have done. So there are things I can do that are going to increase that probability or not. Now, when it comes to buying a property, I'm thinking of two things, right? I want to buy right so that it's going to, on average, most likely give me the return I need within the time frame I need it. That's the first thing. But I also need to accompany that with the right hold strategy. Now, if I've bought a property where the yield isn't as strong as what it needs to be, which means the rent relative to the purchase price, if that's not as high as what I need it to be, what that means is that myself as the purchaser needs to top up the difference. The weaker the yield, the more I need to top up, which that makes sense. But as interest rates increase, my top up is going to increase. So when I'm trying to work it out, I'm trying to buy a property where the yield is as strong as possible and the capital growth projections are high. And that's where I say it's of the citrus variety, because we stipulate that we want the capital growth rate to be no less than 4% as a general rule. The exception is if the client's situation can tolerate less than that, but most often they can't. So we say, well, I want to have a yield of 4%. Well, that gets rid of 4%, and I want it to be a new build. And that's really important. Now, a 4% yield gets rid of 90% of properties on the market. So that's why I'm flippant when I say 90% are of the citrus variety. The yield isn't strong enough for what I need it to be. And when we're setting the the criteria for these properties, not all properties are created equal. We want the yield to be right. I need to work out, well, what is the capital growth rate that I need to be getting on this property? Because that's going to determine the regions that I need to be purchasing in. Some regions aren't going to make the cut. And we know that. And then based on that growth rate, I then need to say, well, these are the regions, but what's the type of property I need? I know that unless I'm buying in Wellington, a 3-bedroom property tends to go up at a faster rate than a 2-bedroom property. I know that an apartment goes up at a slower rate than a townhouse, and a townhouse goes up at a slower rate than a standalone property. All these properties could be good properties, but there is an impact to each of those things. And my job and my coach's job or our financial advisor's job for our customers is to work out, well, what is the gap and what is the performance of the tool I'm going to be using, the investment tool? And if it is a property, because it doesn't need to be a property, but if it is, what does that property need to do? Because I am not interested in buying something for buying something's sake. Like you, right? Why would you go through the faff of that unless it was going to solve a problem? And that's why I don't mean to be flippant, but I am pretty specific that we need the right performing property for the customer situation, because we're here to solve. And if the problem is that if you get a property where the yield is low, because that's in most cities, the yield is much lower. So for example, in Auckland, I'm wanting a 4% yield. Well, I think the average yield in Auckland is 2%. So it's possible to get any old property in Auckland. It's just not the ones that I want to buy. And I want to do that because my hold cost is going to be lower. The lower the hold cost, the more likely I'll be able to hold it. And for many of our clients, they have to leverage on top of that first property, which might be trying to do something else, or it might be buying a second property. And if I have been inefficient in the first one, I am upsetting the momentum that we can build together. So I'm not trying to be cute, but I am, if you know what I mean.
Love that explanation. And on a similar vein, we've actually had a few people ask about if you could elaborate a bit further on like what Enable Me offers. So they've asked, once you've designed a plan, is there ongoing managing, tweaking? How often is it reviewed? I think that ties in nicely to what you were just talking about.
Yeah, so I guess it depends on what you're trying to achieve and how we're going to go about achieving it as to what the best plan of attack for you should be. So often we're working with our clients for 12 months at a time. For many of our clients, we want to improve their capability as well as grow their wealth or get their money working harder, because the two work together. But some people come to us and they already save really well. There's nothing to be squeezed there. They actually just need a module of work completed for them, which will be the design of something and to support them to execute. So it's hard for me to say what the cost would be, but if you were doing a comprehensive 12-month program, probably our most common program is our Get Ambitious program. And that is getting the cash flows in line. So changing your behaviors, getting you mortgage-free faster. On average, we want to get you mortgage-free in 8 to 10 years, and addressing your retirement gap. And if that retirement gap's more than $300,000, looking to purchase an investment property, setting the criteria, getting our property team to shortlist properties for you and to design that whole strategy as well. So kind of the whole kit and caboodle, that's what we call our Get Ambitious program. And that will position you for around $1 million worth of gain over a 10-year period. In year one, the cost for that program is around $7,500 plus GST. So that includes the finding of the property and those things as well. That is tax deductible, so it comes down to around $4,500 for that program. If you work with us in year two, that the cost of the program is around $1,500 a year after that. But then I've got some clients who don't need to improve their behaviors or their capabilities. They don't need to pay their mortgage off faster. They just need an investment plan, and they need to invest that money better, but they need the strategy before they actually narrow down to the product that they should be choosing. That normally is an 8 to 10 week piece of work. The cost of that piece of work is around $2,500 plus GST. Then we've got some clients, obviously, who are not even on the property ladder yet, and that's obviously a smaller program again. So it depends on your situation, whether we just want a module of work or whether we actually need to get into a rhythm of behavior. That probably is determined by whether you yourself are a shopper or a saver, or if your partner is a shopper or a saver, which you'll be able to determine. But yeah, so I guess the range of programs ranges from $1,500 a year to more than $10,000 a year if you want to have an almighty year. But if we are just actually doing modules of work, it's a lot cheaper. And if we've done that first year, to maintain that is a lot cheaper as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Hannah. And last question before we end the session, just someone asking what you get in the 90-minute consultation.
Yeah, cool question. So you come to that session, so your financial advisor, your financial coach, there'll be a wealth coach as well. So their job is to understand, where are you at now? What are you trying to achieve? And what are you on track to achieve if you just keep doing what you're doing? Because you need to know that. And based on that, they'll be able to say, well, this is your retirement number. Then they'll determine, can they improve your capability based on following some Enable Me methodology? And then if they can do that, how much does that reduce your retirement gap by? Then they want to work out, can they also get your money to work harder? Because the best returns are when you bring those two things together. And based on that, they'll be able to recommend they'll be able to show you what they can achieve and recommend what program is going to be appropriate for your tendencies and your goals and timeframes. So that will be in the that first session. If you work with us in a program, we then move into a 4-week design period. So before we officially start the plan, we need to design it. We need to test different things. So we tend to see you 2 weeks later and 2 weeks after that. And depending on if you're on our Maximizing Momentum program, we're going to see you 2 weeks after that and then 2 weeks after that as well. But depending on the program, it's normally a 4 to 6 week design period where we're testing assumptions, making sure that you're happy, feels okay, and understanding what the banks are prepared to do or what we need to do to improve things in order to get more from the bank. So we're trying to position it so you are informed with why we want to do certain things in a certain order to unlock them as much gain for you as possible. Then we sign off on that plan with you, and then that starts the 12-month period. And we break that 12 months into quarters or 90 days. We have a 90-day cadence that we're working to, where we're setting targets, savings targets, spending targets, and wealth strategies. We have accountability sessions every 90 days for things you need to do and we need to do, because we need to keep that momentum going. And then outside of that, we're working on wealth goals each quarter, trying to layer that on depending on what the program is that you're in.
Awesome.
Wow.
And that's all we've got time for today. We've actually gone a little bit over time, but we wanted to make sure we got those last few questions in. And thank you everyone for joining us.
Yeah, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope to see you soon.